Greetings, friends of liberty. It was indeed with some sadness that we saw, in 1776, our fellow countrymen, who now call themselves Americans, depart from our blessed Union. We shall miss their industriousness and independence, and we wish them well. I suspect in the end, were I, like Nostradamus, to peer into the future, that over time, as the many commonalities of our heritage come to the fore, their love of freedom shall combine with ours to provide a solid bulwark on their side of the Atlantic in this sometimes dangerous world we both inhabit. The same sadness, however, cannot be extended to another departure, namely from England itself to America, of a cult that left 2 years prior. The Shaking Quakers, or as they later became known, simply the Shakers, developed into their own sect because quaking wasn't enough for them and their founder, Mrs. Anne Lee of Manchester. No, they needed to shake as well as quake. It is indeed of interest that once she landed in America, Mrs. Lee had not the slightest difficulty gathering hundreds of such individuals in 8 communities, I have heard, throughout all of New England. Now, if we turn to the issue of the formation of cults in your own 20th century in Switzerland, Germany, the US, and England, we find the curious phenomenon of the rise of the mythological ideology of Carl Jung, combined at times with his objective insights into human nature and psychology. How shall we understand his movement? As a sect, a religion, a branch of psychology? Some hybrid amalgamation? It is to answer these questions that arguably the preeminent living historian of Carl Jung, Richard Noll, wrote his book, Aryan Christ, The Secret Life of Carl Jung. Noll, at times, professor at Harvard and MIT, here reveals in detail the formation of Jung's character and the history and nature of the group which formed around him. He remarks from the very beginning of a difficulty, the fact that Jung's heirs refused to release and open the full use of all of his papers, documents, and diaries. And that what has been released, like letters, have often been heavily edited and selected by his estate for a favorable depiction. In addition, Jung's own alleged autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was actually assembled by a follower after his death and written by her in the first person. As Noll says, it has actually obscured the story of a Jung who is much more interesting. Thus, this book is not a conventional biography, but what one can piece together of Jung's life and character from the sources which do exist, which are still somewhat plentiful. As most psychologists would, Noll begins by focusing on familial, social, and cultural influences as Jung matured. Let's note some of the cultural first. A. Jung grew up in a Germany that was more and more nationalistic and ethnically proud, and which started to believe in the idea of a Volksgeist, the alleged unique characteristics or genius of the German people as a single nation, determined by language, climate, soil, landscape, and race. To understand how these feelings emerged in German society and affected Jung, Noll briefly traces, for example, the celebrations of gymnastics societies and student fraternities that Jung's grandfather, also called Carl Gustav Jung, but spelled with a K, had eagerly participated in. His grandfather's family was friends with Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German nationalist pastor, and when young, Jung's grandfather had converted from Roman Catholicism to Protestantism. B. We shall see later that Jung regarded himself as a redeemer of mankind in the spirit of Christ, and this was, in a way, what Schleiermacher and others had preached, comparing themselves to old German patriotic heroes of antiquity or legend, such as Arminius and Siegfried. But the key difference to those Protestants like Jung's grandfather was that Jung deep down ended by comparing and styling himself to pagan and not Christian heroes. In fact, the chief goal of his cult was to free people from what he regarded as the psychological oppressiveness of Christian ideology and sexual repressiveness. C. Jung's grandfather, expelled from Prussia because an associate had attempted to assassinate an official, moved to Paris and then to Basel, Switzerland, where he obtained a professorship as a doctor of medicine. D. Jung believed that your ancestors' characters determine your character. As Noll said, in a seminar he gave in Zurich in 1925, Carl Jung expressed his belief in the idea of ancestor possession. That is, that certain hereditary units would become activated under certain circumstances in one's life, allowing the spirit to then take over one's actions. E. His mother, Emily, was a psychic and had encouraged Jung to be engaged in spirit communications with his family and relatives. She had gotten her beliefs from her father, a noted pastor and Old Testament scholar who conducted seances in his room, speaking with the dead in Hebrew. Jung, too, when he was around 20, began his first formal dialogues with the dead. And in June 1895, he and a circle of female kin first gathered in secrecy to contact the spirit world. This spiritualism, not unusual in the 1920s. Later, he subsequently led or conducted extensive seances in which a cousin, Helene, called Heli, channeled the spirit of Jung's grandfather, who led them through spirit world adventures, including one trying to prevent a relative who had emigrated to Brazil from having a black baby there. They failed. She did. This event was regarded as a great shame. F. Now that he had reached 20, girls and even women of all ages practically fell into his arms, given his height and broad shoulders, his piercing intellect and delightful wit, his promise as a man and as a mate. And women who were a bit older admired all this and more, for they sensed his acute emotional sensitivity. This ability to inspire women remained a virtually lifelong attribute. G. At university and afterwards, Jung read widely in books on Christian mysticism, the spiritualist theology of Emanuel Swedenborg, romantic mysticism, evolutionary biology, and German philosophers such as Goethe, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Schelling, although these primarily for their speculations about spirits, not their philosophy. H. He also realized about this time that what his cousin Heli was saying during her channeling of spirits was a simple regurgitation of what she had heard or read previously. This process is actually called cryptomnesia, in which again the person simply recalls information that he doesn't consciously remember obtaining, but may interpret as new. I. In 1900, as part of his training as a psychiatrist, Jung began work at the world-famous asylum clinic at Bergholtze, thus receiving plentiful exposure to psychiatric disorders of all kinds, from schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, alcoholism, and hysteria. And what did Jung decide to write his dissertation on? His cousin, Heli, with whom he had conducted seances. The result was that, while this project eventually became Jung's first publication and helped launch his psychiatric career, it proved disastrous for his cousin, since he portrayed her as being slightly abnormal mentally. In the dissertation, Jung never took seriously the actual existence of spirits or otherworldly beings, which it sure seemed like he had when he had conducted the seances with her. J. Jung first met Freud in 1906, in effect, as he admitted, developing something akin to a religious crush on him. But by 1913, their relationship had ended. It was after they broke that Jung developed many of his famous ideas: psychological types, the collective unconscious, archetypes, and individuation. Jung, during this time or earlier, believed that the ethical problem of sexual freedom is really enormous and worth the sweat of all noble souls. But 2,000 years of Christianity can only be replaced by something equivalent: an irresistible mass movement. And so we can argue that this is precisely what he subsequently attempted. Noll argues that although others have attributed to Freud the most important influence on Jung, the reality was that other individuals, such as therapists Otto Gross, Sabine Spielrein, and Antonia Wolff, had equal or greater influence. Let me briefly describe these. Number 1, Otto Gross. Gross, an early protege of Freud, was one of the wild men of early psychoanalysis, taking drugs, giving impromptu all-night psychoanalytic sessions, and holding his audiences spellbound while telling them to repress nothing. Gross, very charismatic, believed in the theory of personal growth through sexual promiscuity. Sexual liberation. The result? As the wife of famous German sociologist Max Weber described it, they watched marriages bend and break around them as Gross personally converted her friends to the practice of polygamy. Jung, for his part, at times weaned Gross off of his opium, cocaine, and codeine addiction. Gross's wife, Frida, left him for weeks at a time just so she could recover from his constant attempts to psychoanalyze her. Jung started to accept Gross's sexual theories after doing therapy with him. As Noll says, Jung came to believe that not giving in to a strong sexual impulse could result in illness or even death. As Jung wrote to Freud, the prerequisite for a good marriage, it seems to me, is a license to be unfaithful. This, after 1909, was what he recommended to male clients. Number 2, Sabine Spielrein. She was perhaps the first woman with which Jung, after the influence of Gross, became unfaithful to his wife, Sabine saying as much in a letter to Freud. Number 3, Antonia "Tony" Wolff. Here was another patient a year after Spielrein that Jung seduced. She enjoyed it so much, she became his lover for 40 years. After a while, he let her treat patients, too. Jung built a special stone tower in Bollingen in which he and Wolff spent alone together for weeks, his wife Emma, whom Jung married in 1903, being ignored. Interestingly, throughout their relationship, Jung and Wolff had tremendous arguments and separated from each other for months at a time. Sometimes this was because Jung became interested in other women. K. From 1912-13 on, Jung, as mentioned earlier, developed many of the ideas or techniques for which he's famous, notably the collective unconscious, he imagining that we all share or inherit psychological experiences from our ancestors, the genes somehow storing and conveying the experiences. In order to get proof of this, he had assistants collect the transcriptions of the dreams and ravings of those in the clinic to see whether commonalities might not be found. The result, his assistants entered the wards and found exactly what Jung told them to look for: ancient pagan gods in the unconscious of their patients. Later on, Jung deliberately falsified some of these records and their history to make it appear that these patients had not been previously exposed to books on mythology, from whence they actually had gotten their material. L. Freud, who still hadn't broken with Jung yet in 1912, noted all this increasing connection of the supernatural with race and ancestry and genes, and could see not just the idiocy of it all, but also the danger for Jews it would cause. And Freud was right, since Jung himself confessed to another person that, "Until now I was no anti-Semite, but now I'll become one, I believe." M. From his experience with spiritualism, Jung utilized and induced trance states in himself, which he called active imagination, and which sparked a series of intense, visionary experiences that he interpreted as his direct mystical initiation into one of the most ancient of the pagan mystery cults of the Hellenistic world. From this point on, his life changed as he started living more and more according to these fantasies and inclinations, and started believing that he had actually, through this experience, transformed himself into a god, that he had been deified as the Aryan Christ. As a consequence of his changed belief, he resigned from the presidency of the psychoanalytic movement and withdrew from his lecturer position at the university. Jung then came to believe that anyone potentially was capable of undergoing this deification experience, and that he could help them do it, since he had discovered it. Incidentally and ironically again, he here ignored the process of cryptomnesia in himself. Jung said, "I had read much mythology before this fantasy came to me, and all of this reading entered into the condensation of these figures." In fact, Noll argues that a significant source of Jung's material was a Friedrich Kreutzer, who was a professor of ancient literature at Heidelberg University in the 19th century. And Jung's reliance on the Belgian historian Frans Koumont for some additional material backfired, since Koumont has since been shown to have been significantly mistaken in his understanding of ancient history. So much for the accuracy of Jung's second sight. For Jung, the racial component in this deification was essential. He believed that within each native European there was a living pre-Christian layer of the unconscious psyche that produced religious images from the Hellenistic pagan mystery cults, or even the more archaic nature religions of the ancient Aryans. And he envisioned the task of his therapy to bring the pre-Christian layer back to the surface for his clients. Jung's fantasies of this process got to such a point that he would ask questions of a female deity he claimed he was in contact with in a trance state, and then in a falsetto voice would give her answer. Another time in one group meeting, he actually pretended that crusading knights had come back from the dead to visit his house. His house. Jung reported, "The atmosphere was thick. Believe me, I knew something had to happen. The whole house was filled as if there was a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed up right to the door, and the air was so thick it was impossible to breathe." During these times, he also kept a loaded pistol next to his bed and vowed to blow his brains out if he ever felt he had entirely lost his sanity. Tony Wolff helped him through this troubled time, and somehow he made it. As often happens with the religious, for whom self-deception about their religion is essential, Jung said, "I have had experiences which are, so to speak, ineffable, secret, because they can never be told properly and because nobody can understand them." Again, they can be understood just in secular terms like cryptomnesia, that he didn't want to employ. But spelling out the nature of his self-deception would be the last thing Jung wanted to do. That would destroy it by explaining it. Jung also tailored revealing his fantasies to only trusted people, hearing his extremely irrational fantasies, and less trusted, more conventional fantasies. Thus, as Noll remarks, he put on different masks for different people. And women continued to be attracted, so much so that many foreign women left their homes and set up residence in Switzerland so that they could be near Carl Gustav Jung. Noll goes into great detail describing these women and Jung's interactions with them. Let's review 3 cases. Number 1, Fanny Bowditch. Fanny's father, Henry Bowditch, a professor at Harvard Medical School, was a friend of psychologist William James, and both were interested in spiritualism.
Thus, when her father died and Fanny had a life crisis and deep depression, Jung, the quasi-spiritualist, was recommended by her cousin James Putnam, a world-famous Harvard neurologist. So Fanny traveled to Switzerland with Jung for speaking of her in a letter to Freud, saying she was in a loving jealousy over me. But given her difficulties with German, what he did was have his female colleague, Maria Molzer, treat her. In this case, as in others, Noll argues the beneficialness of Jung's recommendation to these ladies that they read extensively in various subjects, improving their general level of knowledge. But otherwise, the result of all this obviously cult-like atmosphere and Fanny's depiction of it in her letters home to cousin Putnam meant that Putnam instead became a fan of Freud, not Jung. And Jung, who had been angling to convert Putnam and utilize him to spread his ideas in America, failed. Fanny eventually married a Dutch Jungian therapist, Johann Katz, lost her awe of Jung, and resented the polygamy that Jung urged on her husband. Number 2, Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Edith, in essence, was partly responsible for popularizing Jung and his ideas to the world. Starting treatment in 1913, after the death of a child and her subsequent depression, and while also experiencing agoraphobia, she was wealthy enough to become a Jungian analyst, renting rooms in a nearby hotel for 8 years to see her clients. Her husband, for his part, convinced by Jung of the power of polygamy, and tiring eventually of Edith's stay in Switzerland, by 1921 had had enough and married an opera singer. Edith, after returning to America, her agoraphobia apparently not cured, largely became a recluse. Through her experience with Jung, her father, John D. Rockefeller himself, despite knowing little academic psychology, distinguished himself by recognizing the cult-like atmosphere of the Jung group. Number 3, Constance Long. Long, an English physician, was enticed, as women often were, by Jung's religious appeal and his call to save the world, by unleashing the God within. Nonetheless, she did not develop the extreme one-sided mystical element in her professional work that Jung and his other apostles seemed to nurture, and never spent more than 2 months in the rarefied atmosphere of the Jungian colony. Long, as well as fellow American Jungian therapist Beatrice Hinkle, developed the idea that men could have a female subself, and women a male subself, which, if not actually true, perhaps at least could be therapeutically useful. Like most female clients, Long initially fell in love with Jung, but in this case, he didn't add her to his harem. Eventually falling out of love, she left, along with others, for a new guru, the Russian mystic Peter Ouspensky. Jung tried to stop this in his letter to her, appealing to his racial ideas. Jung said, "Why do you look for foreign teachings? They are poisons. They did not come out of your blood. You should be on your own feet and have your own rich earth below them. Why should you listen to the word of a man who is off his own soil?" This is just one example of the intellectual garbage that Jung passed off as the truth. Happily, in this case, Jung's nationalist and racist appeal didn't succeed. Noll ends the book by describing in depth these racist notions that Jung entertained and used to attract many Swiss and Germans to his cult. But if they were Jewish Swiss or Jewish Germans, they weren't welcome or accepted as clients. He also said at one point, "You know, I would never like to have children from a person who has Jewish blood." Reading these comments, it's not surprising that his estate would be loath to open the archives and reveal more of Jung's character. In conclusion, this book is brilliant. I'd give it an A, it functioning as a welcome antidote to the hundreds of fawning, adulatory, and credulous books on Carl Gustav Jung. To see someone reveal the face behind his masks, to tear away the self-deceptive legend, and show the emptiness of his ideology is satisfying. In this case, just as with Freud, the truth in the end has emerged, although too late for many. Happy again for my part that those shaking Quakers have left for other parts. I wishing them all the very best. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.